recording, and I will. So before we dive back into Deuteronomy, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on Hanukkah, just because it is where we're at, and what I think is the most widespread misunderstanding about Hanukkah. And by widespread, I mean almost universal. So you'll forgive me for what may seem somewhat heretical today. But I want to talk about, just for a couple of minutes, the miracle of Hanukkah, or let us say the true miracle of Hanukkah. So what I'm going to do now, is to share my screen a little bit. Okay, and what you see here, let me just make this smaller, I hope. Yeah, what you see here is from the Talmud, section called Shabbat, and the language is going to be very familiar in a minute. There are a discussion of various laws of Hanukkah here. And here we're going to look at the last one before what I really want to look at. The sages taught it's a mitzvah to place the Hanukkah lamp at the entrance to one's house on the outside, so that all can see it. If he lived upstairs, he places it in the window adjacent to the public domain. In time of danger, he can place it on the table, and it is sufficient, right? That is to say that one should light visible to the street. And then Rava, another sage, says one must kindle another light in addition to the Hanukkah lights in order to use its light, as it is prohibited to use the light of the Hanukkah lights. This is the origin of the shamas. The purpose of the shamas is to provide light to the room so that one won't benefit from the use of the Hanukkah menorah for any purpose other than to publicize the miracle of what happened during Hanukkah. And so we need another light. So if we happen to glance at a watch or something else, we will be able to say, well, we didn't use the light of the Hanukkah lights for that. And if there's a bonfire, you don't need that light, right? If you got something going in the fireplace. In fact, the truth is, if you have, electric lights, at least in theory, you don't need the Hanukkah light. But if he's an important person who has that kind of light going, even though there's a bonfire, he needs a shamas. Okay, now I want to get to what I think is the most interesting question, and here you're going to see something that's very, very well known, except for this first statement. The Gemara, that's the Babylonian Talmud, and this part of the Talmud, after the year 200, the Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah? Question. Answer. The sages taught, on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. One doesn't give a eulogy on them. One doesn't fast on them. The reason, when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame and emerged victorious over them, they searched, found only one cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priests. And that was sufficient there to light for only one day. A miracle occurred, and they lit it lit the candelabrum from that one cruse of oil for 8 days. And the next year they instituted these days and made them holidays with the recitation of Hallel and special Thanksgiving prayers and blessings. Okay, we're going to end the share. So, a very, very well-known story. The basis for Hanukkah, when they entered the temple, the victorious Maccabees, they found only enough oil for one day. Miraculously, it lasted for 8 days. There's several problems with this explanation. The first one is, why are they asking, what is Hanukkah? They've already talked about how you observe it, right? Where you put the menorah, what do you need a shamus, all of that. Now suddenly, in the middle of this, they say, oh, what is Hanukkah? Very, I think, very odd. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this is a relatively late source. All of the earlier sources, going back to the books of Maccabees, make absolutely no mention of this miracle. They talk about 8 days. They don't say anything about a single cruse of oil. And you may be familiar with the Al Hanisim prayer, which we say is part of the Amidah during this period. The Al Hanisim prayer remembers that God delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the mighty into the hands of the few, and says that they went into the Maccabees, our ancestors, went into the temple and they kindled lights. Period. No explanation, no sense. There was only one cruse of oil. It's completely missing. In fact, it's completely missing from just about everywhere before this relatively late source. So why do they say this, and what do they mean by it? Oh, one more thing. I would suggest to you that as miracles go, this is really paltry. Think about this, right? So they come into the temple. There's only enough crude oil for one day. They light it. What terrible thing would have happened if it hadn't lasted long? They would have waited around. They would have gotten more oil, then they would have lit it. I mean, why do we have this sense of a miracle? And we have great miracles in the Jewish tradition, and going back to the Exodus and the plagues and the sea splitting. I get that, but here? So I think, and the first part of this is speculation, but I think that we have to remember that these sources come to us from a Jewish community that's under occupation. They're under occupation by the Romans. There had been revolts against Rome. The latest one in 135 under Bar Kokhba. The revolt is quashed, and now the Jews live under occupation. And they have somewhat tenuous ties with the Roman government. If we think about Hanukkah in its historical context, Hanukkah is about a revolt. It's about a successful revolt by the people against Antiochus, the Greek king. It's a somewhat dangerous story if you are a conquered people to be celebrating such a revolt. So maybe we needed a different story. And this story has no military overtones at all. It shifts away from the military victory and describes something that happened. They came in, they found a little bit of oil, and it lasted a long time. And that's a miracle. And I want to suggest to you that what we're really looking at here is something that is more symbolic than actual. Because what does Hanukkah really commemorate? It commemorates the fact that Judaism was due to be extinguished in the time of the Greeks. Our light was meant to go out. And by all reasonable circumstances, we should not have lasted. But miraculously, we did. And in fact, if you follow the Talmudic argumentation, our light will grow from day to day as we continue to endure and to strengthen. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why the menorah, and we saw it in the halakha, the menorah was meant to be placed in the window. It needs to be in a public place because it is essentially the evidence that the miracle continues. If you walk around a Jewish neighborhood and you look and you see, they have a menorah and they have a menorah and they have a menorah, well, it's still happening. And the miracle is still evident. And we, despite not just the persecution of the Greeks and the Romans and Hitler and even the extraordinary massacre which took place in Israel, we're still here. And that I think is the miracle that Hanukkah is really about. And that miracle is encoded in a story, a late story, which in some sense expresses it. Okay, so that's what I have to say to you, my sermonette, if you will, on Hanukkah and its true meaning. I am going to open things up just for a minute. Yeah, Saul, go ahead.
I have an old copy of the Birnbaum Siddur, and it has the Megillat HaShmonaim, and I'm reading here that that it says the Hayava Kishir Halakat Yom Echad. They only had the quantity seemed sufficient for only one day. Belohei Hashemayim Asher Shikein Shemosham Natan Bracha V'Hidiko Mimeno Shmona Yamim. So it does say 8 days in the.
I don't know that source, Megillat HaShmonaim. It is not. It's not the book of Maccabees. At least in the first or second books of Maccabees, it's not mentioned. So I'll look into it. I thank you for pointing it out, because I looked in both books of Maccabees. So I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just going to make a note. Thank you, really. Megillat. Thanks. Okay, I will try to come back to that. Yes, Sandy.
So, Rabbi, I think you said before that the 8 days.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
Referring back to the men fighting, were not able to celebrate Sukkot. So this is sort of a delayed celebration. I think you've said that before, right?
I have. So the question then, here's the thing. If we're going to say that it's not about the oil lasting for 8 days, then we need to say, well, why is it 8 days, right? And there are a variety of possibilities, and one of them seems to be that it was modeled after Sukkot, which is 8 days long, and Sukkot is the last holiday that would have been celebrated had they had the temple, right? So it becomes a kind of makeup day, a makeup holiday for Sukkot, and we do have something like that as a biblical model, and that is the makeup for Passover. A person who was on a journey or was ritually impure and couldn't offer the Paschal sacrifice, got to do it later on. Right? So that's certainly a possibility. It's really just an attempt to understand why this would be 8 days long. There are other reasons. It took 8 days to dedicate the temple. If you read in the Bible, the process of dedicating the Mishkan, the tabernacle, it takes 8 days. And it concludes on the 8th day, the Yom HaShmini. So that too, if we're rededicating the temple, perhaps it takes the same amount of time to rededicate it as to dedicate it. Unclear. It's striking, by the way, in terms of the holiday of Sukkot.
Listen, I'll talk to you I'm going to record a video now.
Right. There are two different explanations for how the candles are to be lit. Right? The basic law of Hanukkah is actually that you only need to light one candle every day. That's it. You fulfill the mitzvah by lighting one candle every day. But, says the Mishnah, if you want to do more, then you could light one candle for every member of your household every day. You're a family of four candles the first day, 4 the second, and so on. But if you really want to be pious, then, well, there's a disagreement. Hillel and Shammai, right? So Shammai says you start with 8 candles. Unclear whether they're talking about for each member of the household or just one for the whole family. 8 candles on the first, then 7, then 6, then 5, and so on. Hillel says, no, 1, like we do. We follow Hillel, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 8. So they each give an explanation. So Hillel says, and by the way, Shammai seems the most logical, right? Because the oil should be diminishing over time. Of course, it's a miracle, so you don't have to think about logic. But so if we follow Hillel, he says, Ma'alin b'kodesh ve'in moridin, you should go up in matters of holiness. Holiness should grow, right? Should see more and more of it. So more light, okay? And that's a general principle in Jewish law. Ma'alin b'kodesh. And just to give you one quick example of that, there's a question about what if you sell something from the synagogue, what can you use the money for, right? Let's say you sell the ark covering. What can you use the money for? Answer, only something on a higher level of holiness. Let's say the mantles that are actually placed on the Torah. You can use it for that, right? But you can't just take the money. According to the Talmud, later authorities change this, but you can't just take the money and go spend it on something else. Okay. Ma'alin v'kodesh ve'in moridin, you go up in holiness, not down. What does Shammai say? He says we go from 8 down to 1 to correspond to the number of animals which were offered on Sukkot. You have a lot the first day, and then fewer, and then fewer, and then fewer. And it's interesting to me that Shammai makes that connection between Sukkot and Hanukkah, and in some sense, the idea that this is 8 days because Sukkot was 8 days. But all of these explanations really are there. If you don't have the explanation, it was only 8 days worth of, it lasted for a full 8 days, even though there was only enough for 1 day. Great. Any other questions? Barry?
Yes, there's also the question of why does Hanukkah appear at all in the Talmud? Because it has no basis in the
Yes, right.
5 books of Moses.
Right.
Would
So,
seem to be an addition to what's stated in the 5 books of Moses.
yeah. So I think it's even more than that. It has no place in the Bible, right? In other words, it's not just the Torah. We have Purim. You can argue at least, well, this Megillat Esther, right? The book of Esther, it's in the Tanakh, it's in the Bible. But here we have something that really has no basis. The basis for it is in the book of Maccabees 2, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. They don't make it in. when the Bible is, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh is canonized, and decisions are made as to what is included and what is left out. Maccabees are left out, right? If you want to, I had to do this once. I was studying this, and I needed a copy of the book of Maccabees. You know where you find it? You have to get a Catholic Bible. They include it as part of the Bible. No, they don't celebrate Hanukkah, but they've got it as a sacred work. We do not, right? So there already, you see the rabbis making a decision about Hanukkah. And then it does not appear in the Mishnah, right? Which is around the year 200, when Rabbi Judah, the exilarch, the head of the Jewish community, selects all the important laws and traditions of his day. Where do we find this in the Talmud? Actually, we saw it. It's in the section about Shabbat. There is no section to talk about Hanukkah. And how does it get discussed? It starts out like this. Well, we have various laws about Shabbos candles. We can talk about what the wicks have to be made out of, what kind of oil can you use. And the Talmud, this actually becomes part of the liturgy a little bit, at least you'll see it in some Orthodox Sidurim, b'meh madliki, with what can we light? And there's a list of what you can use and not use. So the Talmud says, oh, since we're talking about candles and oil and wicks, what about Hanukkah? What kind of oil and wick can you use for Hanukkah? And the answer is you can use any kind of oil and wick. It's not like, of course, if you're lighting during Shabbat, it's something else, but any kind of oils and wicks. And then the Talmud goes on to say, well, since we're talking about Hanukkah, what do you do if the menorah goes out? Where are you supposed to put it? How long is it supposed to burn? All that stuff, which is completely missing in the earlier layers of the Talmud. So why? Unclear. It's unclear. I will say one other thing about it. One of the most striking things about Hanukkah, and in some ways the most disturbing, despite the fact that there's a great victory over the Syrian Greeks, Hanukkah is also a Jewish civil war. If you think about the story of how it gets started, right? Mattathias, the father of Judah Maccabee, they're in the town of Modin. The king has sent his emissaries to force the Jews to worship him. There's an altar set up. They take a pig, they sacrifice it on the altar, and they invite the elders of the Jewish community to come and participate in the sacrifice. According to this story, which is in the book of Maccabees, an elderly Jew comes forward. Mattathias takes his sword and kills him and runs off to the mountains. All who are for God, follow me. And that is the beginning, according to the book of Maccabees, of the Maccabean revolt. That is, it starts with one Jew killing another Jew. And there was a fierce battle between Hellenists, sort of very, very liberal, modern, assimilated Jews, and the Maccabees, who were really traditionalists, right? And the Maccabees win that battle, not just against the Greeks, but against their fellow Jews. Is this one of the reasons why Hanukkah, is somewhat problematic? I don't know. I really don't know. But for whatever reason, and maybe it's just that it's not in the Tanakh, but then you can ask, well, why isn't it in the Tanakh? And then you have to again say, why is Hanukkah problematic? That's about what I can tell you about that. Any other questions about Hanukkah or what I've said about the miracle or anything else? Sandy, go ahead.
So, Rabbi, just to support what you said about the miracle, whether that maybe it was not a miracle, is I'm thinking about Maimonides had the 10 things that happen at the end of the sixth day, and put into the miracles and what was put into their nature. The snake that could talk, the donkey that could talk, does not list the the oil put into the oil that it would last for 8 days.
Right. So two things. The first is that that list is not Maimonides. It's in Avot, right? It's in Pirkei Avot. So it's earlier than Maimonides, and it attempts to describe, what we would see as violations of nature, right? A miracle. So, for example, one of the examples that's given there is Bilam, this non-Jewish prophet who is going to curse the Jewish people, but God turns it into a blessing. His donkey talks to him, right? So Pirkei Avot says, well, that was built into the system. You think it's an exception because donkeys can't talk. Well, actually, it's not an exception because it was the exception that was built in. Don't expect any other donkeys to talk. It was just this one. And there's a list of them. My favorite, by the way, in that list is it's such an interesting one. It is the tongs that made the tongs. See, if you're going to make tongs, you have to dip them, I guess, in something, and you have to hold them with something. So where did those first tongs come from? If you needed tongs to make tongs, so it's in the list, right? It's not at all clear that that was meant to be exhaustive, right? In other words, these are 7 things. Are they the only things? Are there other miracles? And clearly there are other miracles that are described that don't make the list. However, nonetheless, I'll take your point. Anything else before we leave the world of Hanukkah and miracles? Hannah?
Yeah, sorry I'm late. Can you just tell me what page we were on?
We have not started yet, so
Oh, okay, good.
I will not only tell you, I will tell everyone.
Good.
Okay, and where we are is, let me just find it. Yes, we're on page 1133. We're continuing now with this series of laws. It is chapter 25, and we're looking at verse 5. 25:5. Again, if you have the Eitz Chaim, it is page 133. And here we have the institution of Levirate marriage. A lever is a Latin word meaning a brother-in-law. So this is the requirement, as we'll see, if a widow has no children from her husband dies, then her brother, the husband's brother, is supposed to marry her and have a child. We're going to read it, okay? So when brothers dwell together and one of them dies and leaves no son, it's interesting that the rabbis in interpreting this halakha say child. They read son generically as a son or a daughter. However, here the text is specific to son. The wife of the deceased shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. So she can't go marry anyone else unless something happens, and we're going to see what that is. Her husband's brother shall unite with her. He will take her to his wife and perform the lever's duty, right? So her husband is supposed to marry her and have sex with her. And then the first son that she bears shall be accounted to the dead brother. So the dead this child, which comes as a result of the marriage of the brother with his sister-in-law, will be considered the son not of the brother, but of the deceased husband, right? So that's the law. I would also point out that he actually has to marry her. It's not just that he has to father a child with her, but he has to marry her. Now, this law is not at all unique to ancient Israel. It is common in the ancient world. The Assyrians, for example, have this. The Hittites have this. So it's, I think, interesting that we think about this as something really odd, but actually, the Torah is just telling us that a certain law which applies elsewhere also applies here. One of the unique things, though, about it, it seems, is that he actually has to marry her. There are other traditions where he just has to impregnate her. But and from the point of view of the Torah, she deserves the protection of marriage. She becomes his wife with all the rights. And what is the purpose of this? Well, first of all, that the son she bears, the first child, if there are other children, it's different, but the first child will be accounted to the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. In other words, this, if I am the brother-in-law who is now the husband, this is not my child. This is the son of the deceased, even though I'm the biological father. And if we were to think about it in these terms, let's assume that this boy's name is Yosef, and his biological father, let's say, is Yitzhak. but the deceased husband is Yaakov, then he is not Yosef ben Yitzhak, right? That's not his father's name. It's Yaakov, right? It's the deceased, his deceased, his mother's deceased husband, right? So he loses connection. Now, any other children, as I said, they will be accounted as though, they will be the sons or daughters of the new husband. So it's an interesting law. As I said, it also occurs in other contemporaneous traditions. There is one problematic aspect to it. Back in Leviticus, we have a list of forbidden relationships. One of those forbidden relationships is marrying your brother-in-law. So it's somewhat problematic. The rabbis immediately say, well, this is an exception. If you have a general category and you have an exception, the exception just tells you about itself. It doesn't tell you about the general category. And so this is kind of, outside of that. So I just learned, speaking of biblical laws of incest, you might find this interesting, at least I did. I learned this from my wife. It seems that the artist Pizarro, who was Jewish, married his uncle's daughter, his cousin. Forbidden relationship, according to the Bible, and was shunned. They were shunned by the Jewish community as a result, because of that law of incest. Beth's just been reading a novel which is based around the life of Pizarro's wife. I don't know the name of it. I would tell you. She said it's very good. But she mentioned this, and I looked it up, and indeed that's the case. That has nothing to do with what we're doing, just interesting to me. Be that as it may, what is the purpose of this? The purpose is, according to this, that his name, that is the name of the deceased, should not be blotted out in Israel among the Jews. So there is this idea that somehow we are perpetuated beyond the grave through our descendants. And somehow there is a sense that we continue to live through them and that they reflect back on us through memory. Now this brings to mind, I think, something which is not at all biblical. It's rabbinic, it's even maybe late rabbinic, and that is the saying of Kaddish, right? So we have this idea that the deceased of the deceased child, the child of the deceased, parent, says Kaddish. Why? To perpetuate his name, to perpetuate his memory. And we, of course, have also within the Jewish tradition this idea among Ashkenazic Jews that you name after the deceased, and in such a way also perpetuate, as it were, the name of the deceased. Sephardic Jews also name after the living, and so in that sense, you don't see that here. Okay, that's the law. Good. What if the husband doesn't want to do it? The brother, he says, I don't want to marry her, and he could have a variety of reasons. He doesn't like her. He doesn't want to share his, to have to feed her and her child. Maybe it has issues around his estate and the claims on his estate. For whatever reason, he decides that, he's not going to do it. And it seems that he has this option, right? Because the Torah doesn't simply say you compel him. It says if he doesn't want to marry his brother's widow, the widow shall appear before the elders in the gate. This is where all these transactions take place, and declare. So she says the following. My husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He will not perform the duty of a lever, right? So she says he won't do it. And she is bringing, as it were, a kind of case against him. The elders of the town summon him and talk to him. And one assumes this is a kind of judicial procedure. And I think it's fair to say that they're attempting to convince him that this is his duty and he must do it. And he insists, and he says, I don't want to marry her. His brother's widow, and now we get this very strange ceremony. His brother's widow will go up to him in the presence of his elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and make this declaration. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And he, that man, shall go in Israel by the name of the family of the unsandaled one. Right? He gets a nickname, and all of this seems to be to disgrace him. Right? He won't do this. By the way, he won't make a name for his brother, perpetuate his name. So what happens to his own name? Right? This is sort of measure for measure. He gets this name attached to him, which is a sign of disgrace. So there are two elements to this ceremony. The first is this something to do with the sandal. And it's really not clear what that's about. Sandals are used, and not just among Israel, but among other cultures, to have to do with conveying things. Land, you give someone the foot, the sandal off someone's foot. There is, and this is kind of odd if you think about it, but think about Abraham, who comes to the promised land finally. And God says to him, walk through the land, go north and south, east and west, wherever your foot trods, that will be yours. Right? He's to walk the land. And so there is some connection. We have in Jewish law in general, later Jewish law, the idea of kinyan, which is acquisition. In order to acquire something, you need to receive something physical. This is even true in a wedding ceremony, where the groom has to give the wife something physical. The transaction, or think about the ritual of selling chametz, right? Yeah. Traditionally speaking, you give the person who is your agent an object or a letter or something to connote that you are actually performing a kind of sale. Right? So it may be that simple, that this is just about somehow changing the status of property or not changing the status of property, that is the estate of the deceased. The spitting is something else, right? The spitting is clearly pejorative. And there's a difference as to whether this is, right, so the Hebrew language is, let me find it, Yarka bifanav. Yarka is to spit. Bifanav can be translated in one of two ways. In the presence of his face, before him, right? Think of the modern Hebrew word lifnei. Lifnei, the panei part is panim, is face, before the face of, in front of. So is this literally that she spits in his face, spits at him, or is it that she spits the ground before him? Rabbinic tradition is the latter. It's not at all clear, though, that that's actually right. However you look at it, what she's doing is meant to disgrace him because he failed to do his duty towards his deceased brother. Now, before we leave this, I am going to share my screen again. And I need to, let's see if I can. All right. Stay with me for a minute. Let's do this. See if I can do this. It's this that I want to get rid of. This is what happens when you try to share two different pages. Try to move this down. There we go. Okay, so now from the book of Ruth, which we actually looked at last time. So Ruth is going to marry Boaz, right? She's gone to the threshing floor with him, and he is intended to make her his wife, but there's a problem. And the problem is that, here, let me find it. He said, "Blessed of the Lord, daughter, your latest deed is greater than the first. Have no fear." He's talking to Ruth, Boaz. "I will do on your behalf whatever you ask, for all the elders of the town know what a fine woman you are. While it is true, I am a redeeming kinsman, there is a closer redeemer than I." This is about something that looks like Levirate marriage. Ruth lost her husband. He is a relative of her father-in-law. And so the question is, can he marry her? Perhaps there's a closer relative which will have that obligation and right to marry her. And so Boaz goes to the gate, just as we had in the Torah, sits down. The Redeemer who Boaz had mentioned passes by. He says, "Come sit here, so-and-so." And he came and sat down. It's very interesting that he doesn't have a name. He is going to refuse to be the Redeemer. He's refused to marry Ruth, and so perpetuate the name of her husband. And so what happens? The Bible robs him of a name. He's just, in Hebrew, it's Ploni, so-and-so. And he came over and sat down. Boaz took the 10 elders of the town, said, "Be seated." He said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, now returned from the country of Moab, must sell a piece of land which belonged to Elimelech. I thought I should disclose the matter to you, acquire it in the presence of those seated, in the presence of the elders. If you are willing to redeem, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. There is no one to redeem but you. I come after you." And the man says, "I'm willing." And Boaz says, "When you acquire the property from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, you must also acquire the wife of the deceased, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate." Clearly the Levirate marriage, though here it seems to apply not just to the brother, but more broadly. The Redeemer says, "I cannot redeem it, lest I impair my own estate." Not clear exactly what this means, but there will be financial consequences for me, making it unwise for me. Therefore, you can take over the right of redemption. And this is what was formerly done in Israel in cases of redemption. To validate any transaction, one man would take off his sandal and hand it to the other. So this is not her taking off the sandal, this is between the men. And so the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Acquire for yourself." He drew off his sandal. And Boaz says to the elders, "You are witnesses today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and belonged to Chilion and Machlon. I am also requiring Ruth as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased, that the name of the deceased may not disappear. You are witnesses today." And they all say, "We are." And make the Lord make the woman who's coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel, prosper in Ephratah and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. All right, so what we've seen here, it's clear that Levirate marriage exists. The rules in the book of Deuteronomy don't seem to be entirely the same rules that are being applied in the book of Ruth. You might remember that we also taught, I spoke in another context about Jacob and Yaakov and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who he refused to give to his son, so as to fulfill the Levirate. Marilyn, could you mute, please? Marilyn, mute. There, thank you. He refused to give to his son, and then she tricks Judah, and she becomes pregnant. There's no sense of wife, right? As it seems to be here, it's against his will. But all of this, the rules may be different, but we see again and again this institution of Levirate marriage. And it goes on for really quite a long time, going back to the early patriarchal age, and then continuing through the book of Ruth. And it continues actually through the rabbinic period, except that what the rabbis do is they do not allow the marriage. Too close to incest, perhaps, even though biblically it's required, they require the act of chalitza. Even if the brother wanted to marry his sister-in-law, he's not allowed to. They have to go through this ceremony. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and take some questions. Carol, go ahead.
What about the woman? What, she has no right to refuse?
That is a good question. That occurred to me also. So the answer from the point of view of the Torah is no. At least it doesn't, it's, but I think she does in an odd way. Let's look back to, let's get back to the beginning. If the man does not want to marry his brother's widow, this is verse 7, the widow shall appear before the elders and declare. So presumably, if she doesn't want to marry him, she doesn't have to go. But there's a kicker, and that is she can't marry anyone else. Right? Because she is supposed to marry this guy, and the only way to get out of that obligation is to go through this ritual. Right? So it's, on the one hand, we would say she doesn't have to marry him if she doesn't want to, but it leaves her in a rather precarious state. And from an economic point of view, right, she is rather, is precarious, and she probably would do better to marry this man. Now, if she says, I'm now speculating, she says to him, yeah, I have to marry you. I'm going to make your life hell. Or something like that. She probably could have some influence, especially since the economic consequences for him, as we saw in the story in Ruth, may not be so great. But still, this is not a feminist work, to say the least. Okay, Barry.
So what seems that the prohibition for the woman is against marrying outside of the family, but maybe the brother is first. First in line.
Yes. So the question is, and you're basing that around.
So we kind of saw that in the book, which you just showed us
in line.
From the book of Ruth.
I think the brother has the obligation. It's not clear that others have the obligation, right? If the brother refuses, it's clear, at least in rabbinic law, she's free to marry anybody. And this it's not that, well, there's somebody else, some other relative. If the brother refuses, they go through this ceremony, and then she's free. But if you look at Ruth, I don't know, could Ruth have married somebody else? It's very hard to, here we have very clear legal terms. The book of Ruth seems to be referring to something, but it's not really specifying. And so a lot of this is really lost in antiquity. And, by the time of the rabbinic period, no one's allowed to do it. So hard to know beyond there. Other questions? Saul?
It was interesting. After what you read about Ruth, it mentions Tamar, which was the next sentence.
Yes, because we're working our way down to King David. This is not the same Tamar. Oh, well, it is actually. I'm sorry. It is the same Tamar. Let me see if I can hold that up again just quickly. I'm looking for, where is share screen? Here it is. Right. Yes. So you're right. So this is looking back. And it's a good point. Thank you. So may your house be like the house of Perez, who is the child of Tamar in Judah, through which, right? So in some sense, what we have in the book of Ruth, and I didn't really notice it, thank you for pointing it out, we have immediately a reference back to that Levirate marriage in the time of Judah and Tamar. So thank you for mentioning that.
Which we just read last week.
Threw it out. Other questions, comments, anything at all? All right, well, I think we're gonna leave it because we only have a few minutes left. So I want to wish you the rest of Hanukkah should be joyous and don't eat too many latkes. Do you know there's a tradition of eating salty cheese on Hanukkah? Not an Ashkenazic tradition, but it goes back to a story not in the Bible, but in the Apocrypha about a woman named Judith, which is not obviously set during Hanukkah, but she feeds this general some salty cheese, and he gets thirsty and he gets drunk, and she cuts off his head. It's a story. It looks a lot like the story in Judges, story of Deborah and Yael, who kills the opposing general. At any rate, so if you're sick of latkes and donuts, and you just, oil is too much oil now, and so I recommend salty cheese. Make a salad, crumble some feta on it, and you'll be in good shape. Anyway, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I will be sending out quite soon the recording, and see you all then. Oh, I mentioned something else also. I know a number of you have been following the podcast that I've been doing, and may have noticed that the podcast has, we haven't had it actually in a few months. We haven't had an episode. My partner has retired from our podcast. He's just simply too overwhelmed in his church and with what he's doing. So I'm reformatting it. It will continue. It'll be essentially interviews, conversations that I'll be having with people. I'm still working on the technological issues of doing this podcast. It's going to take probably another few weeks before I'm up and running. But I hope if you've been listening, you'll keep an eye out for the new ones, which should be coming early in the new year. And on that note, have a wonderful holiday. See you next week.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy